One of the most important discoveries in cognitive psychology over the last 3 decades is that the brain treats incomplete information differently from completed information. A completed task can be archived, a completed conversation can be stored, a resolved problem can be released, but incomplete information remains active. The system keeps a marker attached to it, a kind of cognitive bookmark, a reminder that processing is not finished. This phenomenon is known as the Zeigarnik Effect, first documented by psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik in the 1920s and repeatedly replicated throughout the decades that followed. The effect is remarkably simple. People remember interrupted or incomplete tasks significantly better than completed ones, not because the incomplete task is more important, because the brain continues allocating processing resources to what has not yet been resolved. The system keeps the loop open, and modern information environments are almost perfectly engineered to generate open loops, headlines that are never followed by full articles, articles that are never fully read, videos abandoned halfway through, conversations left unanswered, notifications opened but not fully processed, topics introduced without closure. Every one of these creates a small unfinished process, a cognitive thread that remains active in the background. Individually, each thread is insignificant. Collectively, dozens or hundreds of them create a substantial processing burden. The brain is not only managing what is happening now, it is also maintaining partial representations of everything that never reached completion. Researchers studying attentional control sometimes refer to this accumulation as cognitive residue, fragments of unfinished processing that remain active after the original stimulus is gone. Imagine opening 50 browser tabs. Not because you need them immediately, but because each one contains something you might return to later. At some point, the computer slows down, not because any single tab is demanding much processing power, because all of them together are consuming resources. The human cognitive system operates in a surprisingly similar way. Every unresolved informational loop occupies a portion of attentional bandwidth. Every unfinished context maintains a degree of activation. Every partially processed stimulus continues requesting resources, and most people are carrying far more open loops than they realize. There is another mechanism that deepens this problem even further: task switching costs. For decades, cognitive scientists assumed that multitasking was primarily a matter of dividing attention. More recent research revealed something different. The brain is not truly multitasking in most situations. It is rapidly switching, moving attention from one task to another, then back again, then somewhere else. Each switch carries a measurable cost. Researchers such as David Meyer at the University of Michigan demonstrated that shifting between tasks creates what is known as switch cost, the time and cognitive effort required to disengage from one context and engage with another. The cost is small for a single transition, but when transitions occur dozens or hundreds of times throughout the day, the accumulated burden becomes significant. Consider what happens when you are working. A message arrives, you glance at it, return to the task, a notification appears, you check it, return again. An email comes in, you read the subject line, return once more. From the outside, these interruptions seem minor. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, perhaps less. But internally, each interruption requires the brain to reconstruct the original context after returning, to remember where it was, what it was doing, what remained unfinished. The interruption itself is brief. The reconstruction is expensive, and because digital environments create continuous opportunities for switching, the brain spends increasing amounts of energy rebuilding contexts rather than progressing through them. The result is a state many people recognize immediately: a feeling of being busy all day without moving deeply into anything, a sensation of constant activity paired with surprisingly little completion. Not because effort was absent, because effort was fragmented, distributed across too many contexts, across too many unfinished loops, across too many competing demands on a system that evolved for a world with dramatically fewer simultaneous inputs. There is a specific physiological consequence of this pattern that researchers have only recently begun to understand more clearly. Mental fatigue is not merely a psychological sensation, it has biological correlates. One of the leading theories involves the accumulation of metabolic byproducts in neural networks associated with sustained cognitive effort. Researchers studying cognitive fatigue have identified changes in glutamate concentrations within regions of the prefrontal cortex after prolonged periods of demanding information processing. The prefrontal cortex is the system responsible for planning, decision-making, impulse control, prioritization, and complex reasoning. It is one of the most metabolically expensive structures in the brain. And unlike a muscle that can alternate between activation and rest, the modern informational environment often keeps the prefrontal cortex engaged continuously for hours, not necessarily with deep work, often with shallow work, constant decisions, constant evaluations, constant filtering, constant prioritization. Should I read this? Should I respond? Should I save this? Should I ignore it? Does this matter? Is this relevant? Each individual decision is small, but decision-making itself is metabolically expensive. And when multiplied across hundreds or thousands of informational encounters each day, the cumulative cost becomes substantial. If this video is reaching something you recognize, if you can feel your own system somewhere in these descriptions, this channel has more. Each video builds on the previous one. Subscribe so the next one is already waiting for you. But there is something even more important about information overload than cognitive residue, open loops, or task switching costs. Something that explains why excessive information does not merely exhaust the brain, it changes the way reality itself is perceived. Why a system exposed to continuous informational input gradually becomes less capable of distinguishing what matters from what does not. And why abundance of information can eventually produce the opposite of understanding. In 1972, psychologists Fergus Craik and Robert Lockhart published a paper that fundamentally changed how scientists understand memory and information processing. The title was Technical: Levels of Processing, a Framework for Memory Research. But the central concept was elegantly simple. The depth at which information is processed determines whether it will be meaningfully integrated or simply leave behind a trail of unresolved activation. Shallow processing occurs when information is recognized but not connected to any existing knowledge structure. You saw it. You recognized it as words or images. The system briefly allocated attention to it, but nothing meaningful happened to that information at the level of understanding or integration. Deep processing occurs when information is connected to what is already known, evaluated, questioned, and applied. When it passes through an active process that creates genuine connections with existing knowledge. What Craik and Lockhart documented is that shallow processing, even when accompanied by large volumes of information, leaves very little useful trace in long-term memory, but it does leave a physiological trace in the processing system. An activation that was never fully resolved. An open context that the system keeps in a pending state of processing, and that is exactly what the modern information environment produces on an industrial scale. Hundreds of shallow processing contexts every day, each leaving behind a residue of activation, each contributing to what could be called an accumulation of informational Zeigarnik loops. The Zeigarnik Effect, documented by psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik in the 1920s, describes the tendency of the cognitive system to keep incomplete tasks active in working memory. Zeigarnik discovered that interrupted tasks were remembered far more easily than completed tasks. The explanation lies in how the cognitive system allocates resources. A completed task can be archived. An incomplete task remains active, consuming part of the available workspace while awaiting resolution. In the context of modern information consumption, this mechanism creates what cognition researchers call open loop load. Every article started and never finished is an open loop. Every discussion only partially followed is an open loop. Every news story that generated a question that was never answered is an open loop. Every video that promised something and was abandoned before delivering it is an open loop. The system keeps all of these loops in a state of pending activity. Not because you consciously decided to think about them, because that is exactly what the brain's incomplete task processing mechanism automatically does. And the resulting feeling is familiar to anyone living with a high volume of information consumption. The persistent sense that there is something you should be doing, that there is something unresolved, that the system is occupied with something, but you cannot identify exactly what. It is not anxiety about real problems. It is the cognitive load of dozens of open informational loops competing for processing resources. There is a second mechanism operating in parallel that is rarely discussed in conversations about information overload. Reticular filtering system fatigue. The ascending reticular activating system, a structure within the brainstem that regulates which stimuli reach conscious awareness, functions as the gatekeeper of conscious processing. It determines what in the external environment deserves attention and what can be ignored. In low-information environments, this system operates with remarkable efficiency. It automatically filters out what is irrelevant. It allows conscious attention to focus on what matters. But when the volume of stimuli consistently exceeds filtering capacity, the reticular system begins to exhibit a pattern neuroscientists call filtering habituation. Overloaded by the constant demand for evaluation, the system gradually reduces the precision of its filtering in order to manage the volume. The paradoxical result is that more information enters conscious processing, not because it is relevant, but because the filtering system is operating with less discrimination. And more information entering conscious processing means more open loops, more workload, more unresolved activation. The tired gatekeeper opens the door to everyone. Think about how this manifests at the end of a day of heavy information consumption. The inability to decide what to watch after a day of mental work. The difficulty sustaining attention on a book you were genuinely interested in. The feeling that any new information, even information you want, simply does not enter the system the same way it would in a recovered state. The system is not lazy. Its primary processing resource, working memory, with its 4 active slots, is overloaded by content that entered but was never adequately processed, and the filtering system that should be protecting conscious processing is operating with reduced precision because of accumulated demand. If this video is landing in a way that resonates, if you are recognizing this state within your own system, this channel has more. Each video builds upon the last. Subscribe so the next one is already waiting for you. The cost of excessive information processing does not end with daily cognitive fatigue. It extends into something that directly affects the ability to make decisions, experience satisfaction, and find clarity in situations that should be simple. In 1998, researcher Roy Baumeister and his colleagues published a series of experiments that introduced a concept that changed the way psychologists understand decision-making. The concept was ego depletion, or, more precisely, the depletion of executive self-control resources. The central discovery was that the ability to make decisions, exercise self-control, and resist impulses functions like a finite resource that becomes depleted through use. The more decisions that have already been made, the poorer the quality of subsequent decisions becomes. Later studies identified that this depletion is not limited to decisions about personal behavior. It extends to any process that requires evaluation and choice, including the continuous stream of information processed throughout the day. Each time the system processes a piece of information and determines its relevance, priority, and disposition to act, archive, discard, respond, or ignore, a small portion of executive evaluation resources is consumed, not dramatically, but cumulatively. After evaluating 150 notifications throughout the day, scanning 30 articles, and monitoring 20 discussions, the system reaches the end of the day with its evaluative resources significantly depleted, and depletion of these resources has very specific consequences that most people experience but rarely trace back to the real cause. Decisions become either more impulsive or more paralyzed, or both, alternating between the two. The ability to resist attractive but unproductive stimuli decreases. Tolerance for ambiguity declines. The system wants simple answers because processing nuance requires the very resource that has already been depleted, and the feeling of mental clarity, knowing what matters, what to do, and what can wait, begins to fragment, not because of a lack of intelligence, but because the resource responsible for executing those functions has been exhausted. There is a second phenomenon that psychologist Barry Schwartz described with remarkable precision in his work on the paradox of choice. Schwartz documented that increasing the number of available options, from products in supermarkets to information available online, does not produce proportional increases in satisfaction. In many cases, it produces paralysis, dissatisfaction, and the feeling that the choice made was probably inferior to one of the options that was not chosen. The mechanism is the cognitive load of comparison. When there are few options, the comparison cost is low. When there are many options, the process of comparative evaluation consumes substantial resources. And for a system whose resources have already been depleted by accumulated informational volume, the sheer number of options available in the modern environment, from content platforms to information formats to communication channels, represents an evaluative demand that the system often cannot adequately sustain. The result is what many people describe as an inability to decide what to watch. what to read, or what to do. Not because they lack interest, but because the system responsible for making those evaluations is exhausted. Alongside this, there is a third process that is rarely named but contributes substantially to the feeling of persistent overload. Residual informational toxicity. Certain types of information, specifically those that activate the threat detection system without offering resolution or any available action, leave behind a physiological residue that does not simply dissolve when exposure ends. Information about crises you cannot influence, conflicts you are monitoring but cannot intervene in, negative possibilities about the future that the system processed as potentially relevant to survival. Each of these pieces of information activates the alarm system, produces microscopically elevated levels of cortisol, and creates a state of sympathetic activation that finds no channel for release. Because the evolutionary response to a threat signal is action. Fight, flee, mobilize the group, do something that resolves the detected danger. But for most threatening information that arrives through screens, no action is available. The threat has been processed. The activation has been created, and there is nowhere for it to go. This residue of unresolved activation accumulates throughout the day, contributing to the background tension that persists even after the device has been put aside, even after informational exposure has ended. Like a muscle that remained contracted for hours and stays slightly tense even after the load has been removed. There is also a concept that connects all of this with remarkable precision: cognitive recovery time. Research in performance psychology has documented that after periods of intense information processing, the cognitive system requires a period of low input in order to restore depleted resources. Not simply a different activity, a genuine reduction in the volume of stimuli that require evaluation. In environments with constant access to devices, this recovery period rarely occurs completely. The system moves from one high-volume information source to another, from work to social media, from meetings to podcasts, from emails to streaming. The type of stimulus changes, the volume remains high, and the cognitive recovery time the system needs to restore the resources that accumulated depletion has drained never arrives. The prefrontal cortex is the most recently evolved region of the brain and one of the most vulnerable when it comes to sensitivity to overload. It is where the functions that distinguish human processing from other forms of cognition reside. Long-term planning, evaluation of consequences, emotional regulation, complex decision-making, inhibition of impulsive responses. The ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, and relevant to everything explored so far, the executive function of deliberately allocating attention. The prefrontal cortex is also the most expensive resource in the system in terms of energy consumption. The human brain consumes approximately 20% of the body's total energy, despite representing less than 3% of body weight. And within the brain, the prefrontal cortex is disproportionately demanding. Research using functional neuroimaging has consistently documented that after prolonged periods of high-volume information processing, especially the fragmented, shallow processing type characteristic of modern digital consumption, activity in the prefrontal cortex declines measurably and progressively. Not as a metaphor for tiredness, as a real reduction in blood perfusion and glucose metabolism within prefrontal regions during tasks that require these functions. The practical result is that after a day of informational overload, the same person who in the morning could evaluate situations with nuance and make thoughtful decisions is, by evening, operating with a functionally reduced prefrontal cortex. More reactive, more susceptible to impulsive responses, less capable of sustaining perspective, less capable of resisting the next cycle of information consumption that the dopamine system is encouraging. And it is exactly in this state, with a depleted prefrontal cortex and a dopaminergic system pushing for more input, that most people spend their evening hours. Scrolling feeds, watching content they never asked for, consuming information they do not adequately process, adding Zeigarnik loops to a system already overloaded with unresolved loops, and preparing the ground for a night in which the system will attempt to process, during sleep, everything that entered during the day. Everything the 4 slots of working memory could not integrate. All the open loops that the Zeigarnik Effect keeps in a state of active pending resolution. all the residual activation from threat-related information that never found an outlet. There is something about this cycle that is rarely framed with precision. Information overload is not a productivity problem. It is not a time management problem. It is a physiological problem. It is the nervous system operating in an environment that has been designed with remarkable precision to maximize incoming stimuli and minimize the conditions necessary for proper processing. Because proper processing requires space, it requires intervals. It requires the kind of low-input environment that allows working memory to free its slots, Zeigarnik loops to be archived or discarded, the prefrontal cortex to restore its operational capacity, and the allostatic load accumulated from unresolved activation residues to gradually dissolve. The problem is not you. It is the equation between what the system can process and what the environment is putting into it. An equation that, for most people on most modern days, remains permanently out of balance, and persistent imbalance has consequences that extend far beyond cognitive fatigue. It affects the quality of relationships, because genuine presence requires resources the system does not have when it is saturated with open loops. It affects creative capacity, because creativity requires the kind of deep processing that input overload prevents. It affects emotional health, because emotional regulation is a prefrontal function, and a depleted prefrontal cortex regulates with less precision. It affects sleep, because a system attempting to sleep while carrying hundreds of open informational loops cannot access the stages of deep restoration it requires. Now, connecting the core concepts explored here, Sweller's cognitive load theory distinguishes intrinsic load, inherent to the content itself, from extraneous load generated by format and volume, and germane load necessary for genuine integration. The modern information environment maximizes extraneous load while eliminating the conditions required for germane load. The 4 slots of working memory represent the real limit of conscious simultaneous processing. When exceeded, the system processes superficially and accumulates non-integrated residue. Craik and Lockhart's levels of processing framework shows that shallow processing does not integrate information in a useful way, but leaves traces of unresolved activation that persist as cognitive load. Informational Zeigarnik loops describe how every open and unfinished information context remains active in working memory, consuming resources even after the original source has disappeared. Reticular filtering system fatigue explains how volume overload reduces filtering precision, creating a cycle in which more information enters precisely because the protective system has become more permissive. Baumeister's executive self-control resource depletion documents how processing large volumes of information progressively reduces the ability to make high-quality decisions throughout the day. Schwartz's paradox of informational choice demonstrates how excessive content options, combined with depleted resources, produce paralysis and dissatisfaction rather than freedom. Residual informational toxicity describes how information that activates the threat detection system without providing a channel for action creates sympathetic activation that persists without resolution. And prefrontal cortex depletion from informational volume connects everything to the neural substrate itself. The measurable reduction in executive function capacity that governs the quality of all subsequent cognition. If something in this video reached you in a way you recognized, if you saw your own system in this description, share it in the comments. One word. What stayed with you? What changed after seeing the mechanism behind what you were feeling? Because when the system can name what is happening, it has already begun creating the distance necessary to do something different. There is a direct connection between what was explored here and something this channel has already examined in depth. The system that reaches the end of the day, overloaded with open informational loops, depleted prefrontal resources, and accumulated residual activation, is the same system that, when it finally lies down, cannot rest. Because sleep attempts to complete what the day never had space to process. And the mind that will not stop at night is not being irrational. It is trying to close the loops that the day's informational volume left open. That mechanism was explored in depth in one of the most watched videos on this channel. Why the mind cannot switch off at night. Why the brain chooses the exact moment of silence to process what the day accumulated.